There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when something unexpected happens, not the silence of boredom or politeness, but the silence of 100 people collectively holding their breath. The kind of silence that makes the air feel thick, that makes time slow just slightly at the edges, like a film reel losing its rhythm. Most people go their entire lives without ever causing that kind of silence. They move through rooms, they speak their words, they eat their food and shake their hands and say their goodbyes, and the world barely registers the fact of them. Nia Carter caused that silence at 8 years old, on a Tuesday evening in March, wearing a dress with a lopsided hem that her Aunt Deb had let out twice already because the child simply refused to stop growing. She didn't mean to, that's the part worth saying first. She wasn't performing. She wasn't trying to be interesting or brave or strange. She simply saw something and she said it, the way children do before the world teaches them that most of what they notice is better kept to themselves. But we'll get to that. Nia had a habit of waking up before her alarm. Not out of anxiety, she was 8, anxiety hadn't found her yet, not in any language she could name, but out of something more like eagerness. Like the day was already happening without her and she needed to catch up. She would lie in bed for exactly 3 minutes in the gray dark of early morning, staring at the small crack in the ceiling above her bed, the one that looked like the tail of a comet if you tilted your head to the left. Then she would get up. She shared a room with nobody, which she considered one of the better facts of her life. The apartment she shared with Aunt Deb was small, the kind of small where you knew every sound the plumbing made, where the bathroom door had to be angled just right to close fully, where the radiator in winter ticked and sighed like an old man settling into a chair. But the room was hers. She had taped a map of the world to the inside of her closet door. She had lined her windowsill with 4 rocks she had found on 4 different days, each one important for reasons she hadn't fully decided yet. She had a shelf above her bed with 7 books on it, and she had read each of them at least twice. Her mother had given her 3 of those books. She didn't think about that constantly. She was clear-eyed about it in a way that would have surprised most adults who tended to look at her with a particular careful softness whenever her mother came up, as though she might shatter. She didn't shatter. She had learned somewhere around age 6 that her grief was not a wound that needed protecting so much as a fact that needed honoring. Her mother was gone, that was true. Her mother had been the warmest, funniest, most flower-obsessed person Nia had ever known. That was also true. Both things could exist in the same sentence without one canceling the other out. Her mother's name was Billionaire Carter. She had worked as a records manager for a large company downtown. She had believed strongly in good pens and real butter and never going to bed without saying something kind to someone. She had died on February 14th, 3 years ago, when a truck ran a red light on Pemberton Avenue and her small car had simply been in the wrong place. Nia had been 5. She remembered the way her mother smelled, something clean like soap and cardamom, and the sound of her laugh, which started in her chest and rose until her whole face was involved. She remembered those things the way you remember a song you haven't heard in years, not perfectly but unmistakably. Aunt Deb had come to stay the week of the funeral and had never really left. She was Alina's younger sister, and she was nothing like Alina in temperament, louder, quicker to worry, prone to burning rice and then getting personally offended about it, but she loved Nia with a fierce, exhausting completeness that left no room for doubt. She worked long shifts at a hospital as an administrator. She kept a planner that was color-coded in a system only she understood. She called Nia baby girl, even though Nia had asked her no fewer than 16 times to please not do that in front of people from school. It was Aunt Deb who got them invited to the gala. One of the hospital's major donors was affiliated with the Harlow Foundation, and there were 2 tickets going spare, and Aunt Deb had said yes before she fully thought through what a gala meant for an 8-year-old with an attention span calibrated entirely to things she personally found interesting. She bought Nia the dress with the lopsided hem, second-hand but pretty, a deep green that Deb said brought out the warmth in her skin. She braided Nia's hair herself the afternoon of, 4 neat cornrows back with small gold beads at the ends, clicking softly when Nia moved her head. "Stay close to me," Aunt Deb said as they walked into the hotel lobby. "Don't talk to strangers, don't eat anything you can't identify, and for the love of everything holy, do not ask anyone how much money they make." "Why would I ask that?" Nia said. "Because last time we went somewhere nice, you asked the parking attendant. He drove a very nice car." Aunt Deb closed her eyes briefly. "Stay close to me." The Harlow Foundation Gala was held every year on the same Tuesday in March. The timing was deliberate. Alina Harlow had died the previous November, and James had been told by 3 separate grief counselors and one well-meaning brother-in-law that he needed something to look forward to. He had created the foundation instead, which was not exactly what any of them had meant, but was the closest he could manage to wanting something. The foundation funded arts education programs and literacy initiatives across the city, because those were the things Alina had believed in most fiercely. She had grown up poor and library rich, she always said. She had understood early that stories were a form of survival. James had listened to her say this dozens of times over their 11 years together, had nodded and meant it, and now gave substantial amounts of money to ensure that other children had what she'd had. It was the most useful grief he could imagine. The gala was the one night a year he put on a tuxedo and stood in a room full of people and let them see that he was still upright, still functioning, still James Harlow, 63rd on the Forbes list, founder of Harlow Industries, whose logistics software now powered supply chains on 4 continents. He was good at the room. He had learned early how to take up exactly the right amount of space, present without looming, warm without being familiar, confident in a way that made other confident people feel comfortable rather than threatened. He shook hands. He made eye contact. He said the right things with the right amount of feeling. He was somewhere else entirely the whole time. His assistant Patrick had worked for him for 9 years and understood this about him the way you understand weather, not because you can change it, but because knowing it in advance is the only sensible thing to do. Patrick was 31 and originally from Lagos and had opinions about everything, most of which he kept to himself during business hours and all of which he expressed freely when they were in the car. He had brought James an extra cufflink that evening because James had lost one again, and had checked twice that the speech was saved on James's phone and also printed on folded paper in his breast pocket. Because James had once delivered a keynote address from memory after his phone died mid-flight and Patrick had lost 5 years of his life that day. "You look fine," Patrick said in the car on the way over. James was looking out the window. "I didn't ask." "You were making the face." "I don't have a face." "You have several faces. This one means you're thinking about whether any of this matters." James said nothing, which was confirmation enough. "It matters," Patrick said in the same practical tone he used to relay quarterly earnings. "She would want you here, you know she would." James turned from the window. "Don't do that." "You're right, sorry." Patrick straightened his own tie in the reflection of the dark partition glass. "You look fine." James had met Alina Montgomery at a conference in Chicago, 11 years before she became Alina Harlow. He had been 31 and already rich and not yet entirely hollowed out by the effort of being both those things. She had been a senior program director for a nonprofit that was, in her words, chronically underfunded and absolutely determined. She had been wearing a yellow blazer that had no business being as compelling as it was. She had told him within the first 4 minutes of conversation that his industry was an ecological problem he should think more seriously about. He had laughed, genuinely laughed, the kind that surprised him, and had said she was probably right. He had thought about her for 3 weeks before doing anything about it. He was methodical. Alina had found this both endearing and later, after they were married, occasionally maddening. "You couldn't just think about calling someone for 3 weeks, James. That's not how people work." He had told her that he wasn't entirely sure about that, and she had thrown a dish towel at him. He held on to that memory with both hands. He held on to a lot of things. The coffee mug she had bought at a thrift store because it was shaped slightly wrong, and she thought that was funny. The habit she had of reading out interesting sentences to him from whatever book she was in the middle of, regardless of whether he had any context for them. The specific weight of her sitting beside him on their porch on summer evenings, not talking, just existing in parallel, which had been one of the great luxuries of his life, and which he had not fully understood as a luxury until it was gone. She had been 42 years old. She had been thinking about going back to school. She had been in the middle of a novel about a lighthouse keeper. She had been on the ordinary Tuesday morning she died, mildly annoyed about a problem with the kitchen faucet, which James had promised to fix and hadn't yet. He had fixed it the week after the funeral. He didn't know why he was remembering that tonight, standing in the middle of a ballroom with a glass of sparkling water he hadn't asked for and wouldn't drink. He looked around the room. The banners, the flowers white and gold, Alina's colors, the bronze plaque near the entrance arch that read, HARLOW Foundation in honor of ELEANOR HARLOW. He had stood in this spot at this gala for 3 consecutive years. The room was always the same, beautifully arranged, carefully lit, and entirely, completely insufficient. 47 seconds. That was how long Nia was unattended. She had not meant to lose Aunt Deb. Aunt Deb had stopped to speak to a woman she recognized from the hospital, had rested her hand briefly on Nia's shoulder in the way that meant stay right here, and then had done what adults do, which is assume that an 8-year-old will interpret stay right here as an absolute instruction rather than a suggestion with a rapidly diminishing shelf life. Nia wasn't running. She wasn't even particularly curious, not yet. She was just walking slowly along the edge of the room where the walls held framed photographs and a long, low table of information cards about the Foundation's programs. She was the sort of child who read everything: menus, plaques, warning signs, the backs of cereal boxes. It wasn't restlessness. It was more like a compulsion to know what the world was made of. She almost walked past the bronze plaque without stopping. Then the name caught her. She stopped. She looked at it the way she looked at the comet crack in her ceiling, tilting slightly, making sure she was seeing what she was seeing. The letters were large and formal, inlaid in bronze on dark wood, lit from above by a small spotlight that gave the whole thing the feeling of something solemn and deliberate. Deleanorharlow. Nia's last name was Carter, she knew that. Her mother's last name had been Carter, but her mother's first name had been Aliner, and Nia had never, in 8 years of living, seen her mother's first name written on something large and formal and lit from above. She had seen it on the gravestone Eleanor Jean Carter, carved in gray stone in a cemetery that was a 20-minute bus ride from their apartment. She had seen it on the birthday cards Aunt Deb still bought every year on the 3rd of April and left on the kitchen table with a cup of tea. A ritual that made no practical sense and seemed absolutely necessary to both of them. She had never seen it in bronze. She reached up and touched the letters with her fingers, Eleanor. Her mother's name on a wall in the nicest room she had ever been in. She looked for the person it belonged to. That was the logical next step to her mind. There was a name on the wall, which meant there was a person connected to the name, which meant she should find them. As she looked across the room, she saw a tall white man standing slightly apart from the nearest group of people, holding a glass, looking at something in the distance that wasn't there. He was wearing a very good suit. Nia knew a very good suit because Aunt Deb had once pointed at a man in a magazine and said that's what money looks like when it's trying to be quiet. He had dark hair going silver at the temples and a face that was doing an extremely good impression of being fine. She walked toward him. She had no clear plan. She had a feeling, which is something different, and she had always trusted her feelings slightly more than was probably wise. She got to him and stood next to him for a moment, looking up, and then she tugged the sleeve of his jacket, the way you might try to get the attention of someone standing at a height that made other approaches impractical. He looked down. She looked up. She said, "Dad, that woman has our last name." It took him a half-second to process. Then, and this part years later would be the detail she remembered most clearly, she watched his face do something she recognized. Not surprise exactly. Something more specific than surprise. The look of a person who has just touched the place where a wound they had almost forgotten they were carrying turns out to still be raw. He dropped the glass. It hit the marble floor and shattered into a very expensive-sounding collection of pieces, and the people nearest to them went quiet, and then the quiet spread in a radius like a ripple across still water, until a significant portion of the room was looking at the tall man with the broken glass and the small girl in the green dress standing calmly beside him. Nia looked down at the glass. "I didn't mean to make you drop it," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said slowly, "that was my fault." His voice was low and careful, the voice of someone who had just been asked to operate machinery while slightly shaken. He crouched down so he was closer to her height, which meant going down a considerable distance, and he looked at her directly. "What did you say?" he said. "What was the name?" "Eleanor," Nia said. "On the wall it says Eleanor Harlow." She glanced back at the plaque. "Harlow is your name, right? I saw it on the big banner." "Oh, it is." "Eleanor was my mama's name, not Harlow Carter, but still," she paused, considering this. It felt like something. He held her gaze for a long moment, and in it there was an expression she could not quite name but would spend years afterward trying to. It was not sadness, though sadness was in it. It was not recognition, though that was in it too. It was something closer to the feeling of turning around and finding that someone has been standing behind you the whole time, watching, and realizing that you've been lonelier than you knew. "It does feel like something," he said. Aunt Deb arrived in a breathless rush approximately 40 seconds later, apologizing to the surrounding guests, reaching for Nia's hand with an expression that said they would be having a conversation about this in the car. She pulled Nia close. I'm so sorry, she said to the tall man still crouching on the floor. She wanders, she doesn't mean anything by it. She didn't do anything wrong, he said and stood. He was taller standing than he had seemed crouching, and Aunt Deb looked up at him and paused in her apology. Something about him stopped people mid-sentence. Not in an intimidating way, it was more that he had the quality, unusual in a room full of people performing their own importance, of paying complete attention. James Harlow, he said. Aunt Deb took his hand, Deborah Carter. Something passed across his face when she said the name. Quick, controlled, but Nia saw it. She was good at seeing things people didn't intend to show. I wonder, he said, in the deliberate tone of someone choosing words carefully, if you might give me a few minutes of your time. There's a quieter room. Aunt Deb's eyes moved from him to Nia and back. The instinct of a woman who spent her days making sure strangers got what they needed before she asked for what she needed. Of course, she said. There was a small room off the main corridor that had been set up as a meeting space. 4 chairs, a table, a jug of water, the persistent smell of carpet cleaner. A room for the actual work that funded evenings like the one in the ballroom. James sat across from them. Patrick stood near the door, quiet in the way that meant he had registered that something unusual was happening and had elected to be furniture until further notice. James asked Nia her full name. Nia Jean Carter, she said. She had added the middle name herself, age 6, in honor of her mother. He looked at Aunt Deb. Your sister was Eleanor Carter. Oh yes. Oh, she passed. 3 years ago, February, Deb's voice was steady with practice. Car accident. James was quiet for a moment. He placed both hands flat on the table, a gesture that looked like a man making sure the ground was still there. My wife's name was Eleanor, he said. She passed 3 years ago, November. The room held this information. Nia was watching him with the clear, unedited attention of someone who had not yet learned that starring was impolite. She thought about the wall, about the name in bronze. She thought about the way he had looked when she'd tugged his sleeve before he knew what she was going to say, the particular blankness of someone who has learned to hold themselves very still, because stillness is the only thing standing between them and something they can't afford to feel in a room full of people. She recognized that. Not because she felt it the same way she was 8, and 8 has a metabolism for grief that adults slowly lose, but because she had seen it on Aunt Deb, on the bad nights when Deb thought she was asleep. Your Eleanor is on the wall, Nia said. Mine is in the cemetery. James Harlow looked at her, and for a moment the thing behind his eyes that he had spent 3 years holding very carefully in place made itself almost visible. Yes, he said, that's exactly right. Aunt Deb was precise in the way she gave information, especially information about her sister. She had retold the story enough times to doctors, to lawyers, to Nia's teachers who needed to know for forms that she had found a way to say the true things without being undone by them. Eleanor Carter, 39 years old, records manager, Pemberton Avenue, the truck. February 14th, which was a day that the rest of the world spent on candy and flowers, and that Deb spent every year in absolute private misery. James listened with his full attention, the way he listened to everything. He did not offer condolences in the reflexive way people did, the I'm so sorry that meant nothing and was meant to close the topic. He just listened. And when she finished, he was quiet for a moment and then he said, Eleanor, my Eleanor, grew up in this city. She worked in nonprofit education for most of her career. She had a way of talking about books that made you feel like you'd been given something just by listening. Deb looked at him. My sister talked about books the same way. I know they're not the same person, he said. I'm not suggesting, he paused, reorganized. It's only that 2 women, same city, same name, same year. The same thing people say when they hear it, Deb said gently. It is strange. Nia, who had been eating a dinner roll she had acquired from somewhere, and examining the water jug's pour spout with scientific interest, looked up. Mama always said names were important, she offered. She said you live into your name like it's a direction. Neither adult said anything for a moment. She sounds like she was remarkable, James said. Nia thought about this seriously. She was loud, she said, not mean loud, fun loud. She sang when she was cooking even when she was bad at the song. She paused. She was also kind, but the loud part is what I remember first. The car ride home was quiet for exactly 4 blocks. Then Aunt Deb said without looking away from the road, he paid attention to you. He has sad eyes, Nia said. People who have lost someone usually do. Nia watched the city through the window. The lights had that particular quality they got in March, cold air making the halos around street lamps tighter, brighter, almost sharp. She thought about the man in the tuxedo crouching down so she wouldn't have to crane her neck. She thought about the glass breaking, all that sound happening from one small dropped thing. "Aunt Deb," she said. Why didn't Mama ever say anything about a man named Harlow? Deb's hands adjusted on the wheel. Why would she? I don't know. Nia pressed her forehead against the cool glass. She just had his name on her face, like she knew something she wasn't saying. Deb was quiet for long enough that Nia assumed the conversation was over. Your mama knew a lot of things she didn't always say, Deb said finally. That was one of her qualities. The shoebox was on the top shelf of the wardrobe, behind a stack of folded towels in a location specifically chosen to require effort to access. Deb had put it there 3 years ago during the week after the funeral when she had gone through Alina's things with a methodical grief, sorting what could be given away from what needed to be kept. Most of what was in the box she had looked at once, which was enough. Letters, a small bound journal, birthday cards Alina had saved. The kind of personal archaeology that a sister doesn't perform without permission, and which grief occasionally makes unavoidable. She hadn't thought about it in over a year. She thought about it now. She waited until Nia was asleep, really asleep. The deep, even breathing she could hear through the door. And then she retrieved the box and carried it to the kitchen table and made herself a cup of tea she would not finish. The journal she put aside, the cards she set in a pile. She was looking for something specific, though she hadn't admitted to herself what until she found it. A letter unsealed, written on Alina's personal stationery cream paper, her small clear handwriting, addressed at the top to someone called Jay. She had read it once 3 years ago and had thought she understood it. She understood it differently now. Alina had written, "You should know that I've thought about that conversation in Chicago more times than I intended to. I think you're someone who makes a person feel clearly seen, which is rarer than you know. I've decided not to send this, which is probably the right thing to do, but I wanted to write it. Some things need to exist even if only on paper." Deb sat with this for a long time. She was not a person who believed in coincidence as a category. She believed in coincidence as a name people gave to patterns they couldn't trace yet. And she was sitting at a kitchen table at midnight with a letter her sister had never sent, addressed to a Jay, and the only Jay she had met that evening had stood in a marble ballroom and looked at a child who shared his dead wife's name like she had handed him something he'd thought was lost. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket. She went to bed and did not sleep for most of it. 3 days later, on a Friday afternoon, Nia opened the front door because the buzzer had buzzed and Aunt Deb was on a work call in the bedroom, and the rule was if Deb can't get it, you check the intercom first. She had checked the intercom. The intercom showed a man in a regular jacket standing in the downstairs lobby, looking up at the camera with the expression of a person who was aware they were being evaluated and was trying to appear reasonable. She let him up. He appeared in the doorway a minute later. The tall man from the gala, but different out of the tuxedo, more like a person somehow. He was wearing a dark jacket over a pale shirt, no tie. He looked like someone who had dressed carefully to look like they hadn't tried, which was a specific thing she had noticed adults did when they wanted to seem like less than they were. In his left hand was a bunch of wildflowers, not roses, not the arranged kind from a shop with the edges all perfectly even. The real kind, a mixed handful of small blooms in yellow and white and pale purple, held together with a single piece of twine. Nia looked at the flowers for a long time. Then she looked at him. "How did you know?" she said. He looked confused. "Know what?" "About the wildflowers." He held them out slightly, uncertain. I just thought." "My mama liked wildflowers," Nia said. "She said they were the honest ones because they grew where no one planted them." He stood in the doorway and said nothing for a moment. "I didn't know that," he said. "I just thought they seemed like the kind you'd like." Nia considered this seriously, then she stepped back from the door. "You can come in," she said, "but the couch has a broken spring on the left side, so sit on the right." Patrick, hovering at a respectful distance in the hallway, pressed his lips together very firmly. Nia made him sit on the right side of the couch and brought him a juice box with the straw already inserted, which she presented with the gravity of someone offering a formal drink at a state occasion. He accepted it with equal gravity. She approved of this. Aunt Deb emerged from the bedroom with her phone still in her hand and the expression of someone who had expected this. and was still slightly startled by the reality of it. She and James looked at each other across the small living room in the way adults look at each other when they are carrying a shared piece of information and are figuring out how much of it can be set down in front of a child. Nia was aware of this. She always was. She simply chose for the moment to let it happen because she was more interested in the man on her couch. "Did you drive yourself?" she asked. "Patrick drove." "Where does Patrick live?" "North side near the river." "Is it nice?" "He says the view makes up for the parking." Nia nodded, filing this away. "My aunt says we can't afford a view, but we have a kitchen window that shows the neighbor's garden and sometimes there are birds." "That counts," James said. "That's what I said." He smiled. It was a small smile, brief, slightly surprised by itself. The smile of someone who had not smiled unexpectedly in a long time and wasn't entirely sure what to do with the sensation. "Do you like birds?" he asked. "I like the ones that seem like they have opinions," she said. "The pigeons here are very confident. I respect that." He laughed. It was quiet and low, and it seemed to cost him something, the way laughing costs people who haven't done it in a while. Like a muscle remembering its function. Aunt Deb sat in the chair across from them and they talked, the careful kind of talking that happens when people are circling something true, covering it with ordinary words until they find the right moment. James asked about Nia's school. She told him about her teacher, who she respected, and the boy in her class who she did not, and the map project she was doing on trade routes because she had read that you could understand almost everything about history if you followed the things people needed badly enough to carry across oceans. He said that was one of the better frameworks for understanding history he'd heard. She accepted this without false modesty. It was Deb who finally said it. Nia was in the kitchen refilling her own juice box, and Deb crossed to the low bookshelf by the window where she had left her coat, and she took the folded letter from the pocket, and she held it out to James. "This was in my sister's things," she said quietly. "I don't know if it changes anything, I don't know if you'll recognize it, but I think you should have it." He took it, he looked at the front, the J in Alina's handwriting, and something moved through his face that Deb looked away from, because it was too private to witness. "I'll give you a moment," she said, and went to the kitchen where Nia was narrating a detailed account of the juice box's structural inadequacies to nobody in particular. James sat with the letter unfolded in his hands. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Not his Alina's different, smaller, with different loops on the L, but the words. The precise words, the specific economy of feeling in them. "You should know that I've thought about that conversation in Chicago." He had thought about that conversation in Chicago too. He had thought about it with guilt for a year, and then with a kind of sad gratitude, and then he had stopped thinking about it because the year after that his wife had gotten sick, and all the space in him had reorganized around that. He had not known Alina Carter's last name. She had introduced herself at the conference as Alina from the Whitmore Foundation, and they had talked for an hour and a half at a table in the corner of a conference room while the panels they were both supposed to be attending went on without them. She had the same quality his wife had of making you feel that what you said mattered, not because she was performing interest, but because she was genuinely having it. He had thought about her for 3 weeks, and then had recognized what he was doing and had made himself stop. He hadn't known she had died. He hadn't known she had a daughter. He hadn't known that daughter would one day tug his sleeve in a marble ballroom and say something that would break a glass and rearrange the air in the room. He folded the letter carefully and held it in both hands and looked at nothing for a long time. Nia appeared in the doorway with her juice box and looked at him. "Are you okay?" she said. "I'm working on it," he said. She came and sat back down on the right side of the couch, a respectful distance away. "That's what Aunt Deb says," she said, "when I ask if she misses Mama." "It's a good answer." "It's an honest answer," she said. "That's better." He stayed for 2 hours. At no point did he try to be something to her. He didn't perform warmth or manufacture significance. He just sat in her apartment on the right side of the couch and talked to her like she was a person, which she was and which not enough adults remembered. When he left, he shook Aunt Deb's hand and said something to her quietly in the doorway that Nia didn't hear, and Deb nodded, and there was nothing dramatic about it, which Nia found to be its own kind of important. She watched from the window as the black car pulled away from the curb. "Aunt Deb," she said. "Is he going to come back?" Deb was quiet for a moment. "I think so." Because he wants to, or because he feels like he should. Deb looked at her with the expression she sometimes got, the one that meant she was seeing a leaner in her niece and didn't know what to do with it. I think when you get to a certain point, she said slowly, those two things stop being different. Nia thought about this. Okay, she said, and went to get ready for bed. He came back on Sunday. He called first, he had asked Deb for her number, and he texted the night before with a formality that made her smile in spite of herself. And he arrived at 9 in the morning with 2 coffees and a hot chocolate that had been specified as medium temperature, no cinnamon, after Deb had asked Nia her preference and Nia had been very precise about it. They took the bus together to the cemetery, Nia's idea. She had simply said when James arrived that she was going to visit her mama and he could come if he wanted. He had said he would like that. Patrick stayed with the car. The cemetery in March was the kind of beautiful that had nothing to do with comfort, bare trees, iron gray sky. The ground still carrying the cold memory of winter even as the faintest green was beginning at the edges of things. Nia walked the path to her mother's grave with the ease of someone who had walked it many times, who could have found it blind, who had made a private geography of this place that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with love refusing to concede. She placed the wildflowers at the base of the headstone, stood back, tilted her head slightly the way she did when she was taking something in. James stood beside her, he held nothing. He had come empty-handed, which she thought was correct. You didn't bring things to other people's grief, you just showed up to it. I tell her about school, Nia said, and about Aunt Deb burning the rice. She would have found that funny, a pause. I told her about you already, when I got home from the gala. He looked at her, what did you say? I said I met a man who had your name on his wall, and he looked like he needed someone to bring him flowers. James was quiet. Did you bring her flowers? Nia asked. Not today, I didn't know if. Next time, she said simply. He nodded, next time. They stood together in the cold for a while, not talking. The kind of quiet that two people sometimes find when they've been through enough of the same thing that silence doesn't need filling. Nia slid her hand into his. He went very still. She felt it, the slight catch, the stillness of a person surprised by a kindness they hadn't braced for. She didn't say anything and she didn't let go. The sky above the cemetery was starting to show a pale strip of light at the horizon, that particular color that March sometimes produced, not quite gold, not quite gray, something in between, something that looked like the world considering the possibility of warmth. Nia looked up at it. Mama used to say the sky looks different when it's deciding, she said. Deciding what? What kind of day it's going to be? She felt him look down at her, then back up at the horizon. And what do you think it's deciding? He said. She considered this with the full weight of her 8 years of observation and experience. Something good, she said. The Harlow Foundation would announce 3 new after-school enrichment programs the following fall. The largest of them, a literacy and geography initiative in the city's South Side schools, would be named at James's request the Billionaire C program. He had been deliberate about the C. Deb had asked him once what it stood for in the official materials. He said Carter. She said Billionaire would have been embarrassed. He said he knew. She said she would have been proud too, and they had both been quiet about that for a long time. Nia enrolled in the program in September. She was not the first student. She had been insistent that she should wait for the official open enrollment like everybody else. A point of principle James had found both exasperating and entirely consistent with what he'd come to know of her. She arrived on the first day with a pencil case that had planets on it and a notebook already half full of notes she had taken in anticipation of the class. She brought wildflowers from her windowsill to put on the table. The teacher asked where they'd come from. They grew by the bus stop, Nia said. I think they're the honest kind. On the Sunday before the program started, Nia and James stood at her mother's grave like they had made a habit of doing, which they had, the slow, accumulative way habits are made, one repetition at a time until skipping it would feel like missing something. He had brought wildflowers this time, had been bringing them for months. He knew by now that the ones she preferred were the ones that looked like they had gotten there on their own, no cultivation, no arrangement, nothing that would have surprised them into existing. He had also in the months between been going to another cemetery on a different Saturday, Billionaire Harlow's grave. He went alone. He brought her flowers 2 roses which she had actually liked, which Nia had gently pointed out was also valid. He talked to her there quietly about things he was still working out, about a little girl who had found a name on a wall and tugged his sleeve. About how grief, he had discovered, was not a room you eventually left, but a house you eventually learned to live in, one that sometimes, unexpectedly, had another person in it. He had told her about Nia in detail because she would have wanted to know. She would have loved her immediately. That was the kind of person Alina had been, the kind who recognized worth in people without needing them to perform it first. He thought she would have wanted this for him, not because she was sentimental but because she was practical. She had always been more practical than him about the things that mattered. Standing at Alina Carter's grave, the sky that uncertain March color again, Nia's hand in his for the fourth Sunday in a row, he understood something he had not let himself understand before. That loss does not cancel what it touches. It illuminates it. Every person who had loved Alina Harlow still carried a shape of her, still spoke of her in present tense in the private rooms of themselves. And this small girl beside him still carried a shape of her own. Alina spoke to her at a gravestone every Sunday, brought her honest flowers from bus stop cracks in the concrete. Neither of them had been emptied. They had been changed, which was different. And the change, painful as it was, had made them capable of finding each other across a marble ballroom and a broken glass and 47 seconds of wandering. Nia looked up at him. "You're thinking," she said. "As I am. Is it good thinking or sad thinking?" He considered this honestly, which was what she expected of him now and what he had come slowly to expect of himself around her. "Both," he said. She nodded. That was acceptable. She had told him once matter-of-factly that good and sad could live in the same sentence. He had agreed. He had learned since that she hadn't been speaking theoretically. She turned back to the grave, to her mother's name in gray stone, to the wildflowers they had placed, which were already starting to lean slightly in the wind, which was fine, which was how wildflowers were, honest enough to move when something blew through. "Mama," she said, to the stone and to the air and to whatever form love takes when it has nowhere left to go but outward, "this is James. I already told you about him. He has your name on a wall and he brings the right kind of flowers and he's working on being okay." She paused. "We both are."